Welcome, Amy.
Thanks
for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you are COO of Zillow, the #2 boss there, a company with 3,200 employees, a market cap of about $5 billion. You've been there from the beginning, but you actually started out in broadcast journalism. So can you tell us a little bit about how you started your career and then how you ended up at Zillow and how a two-headed shrimp set you on a different path?
Sure. Yeah, it's been an interesting career path. I started, as many of us do, sort of as a child with a dream of what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, and this was in the 80s, and there were great role models like Diane Sawyer on ABC World News and Jane Pauley, and that's something I wanted to do. It's all I could think about, and I majored in journalism in college. I got sort of all the right internships and got this coup of an on-air job at a tiny little NBC station straight out of college. Did that for a year, moved up to a bigger ABC station. I was doing this thing I always thought I wanted to do, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it.
Why did you hate it?
Well, I had this dream of investigative reporting and sort of changing the world with what I could do, and local broadcast was about hurricanes and fires and standing live by the side of the road with a 20-car pileup. And it was, this story I tell a lot because it was my first kind of running into a wall and failure. I had this single-minded idea of what a career ladder was supposed to look like, who and what I wanted to be. I hated it, and I didn't have a plan B. So around this time, it was like 1999, 2000, the first internet boom was happening. And in figuring out what to do with what felt like this failure, I had to think about what sort of transferable skills do I have, and the only thing I could come up with was PR, and there were all these new consumer internet companies that needed to get in the news, so maybe I could do that. Moved to San Francisco, started in PR, and kicked off what has become for the last 18 years my tech career.
And just to close the loop, the two-headed shrimp was the final story that you were assigned to cover.
It was the moment, literally the moment where I said, like, F this sucks. I was in Fort Myers, Florida. I was like 23 years old, and I was sent to report live on the fact that a two-headed shrimp had shown up, had been found by a factory worker on the processing plant. And I was sent to do a story on this two-headed shrimp, and I talked to the woman in the factory who still had her shower cap thing on, who said, yeah, I was sort of sorting through, and I said, this shrimp has two heads. And then I had to talk to an environmental scientist about is it just nothing more than a shrimp with two heads, or is it environmental disaster that's coming to the shores of Florida? And then it was 98 degrees, and I had to report live, and I was wearing a cheap business suit from Ann Taylor and sweating, and it just sucked. And I was like, this sucks. What am I going to do with my life? And
then you went to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And you got into PR. And and then you, at the agency side, but then you joined a company called Hotwire, and that is where you met one of the founders, Spencer Rascoff. And so tell me about that relationship, and then how you ended up going to Zillow.
Yeah, so when I got into tech, I knew nothing about business. I had only been single-mindedly focused on being a journalist, and a journalist not doing meaningful stories. But one of the things that PR afforded me was a seat at the table around really interesting problems that businesses and extraordinary leaders were trying to solve. So I had a front row seat into acquisitions and IPOs, crises, and I was able to kind of, through osmosis and being there and asking a lot of questions, learn how great leaders handle these situations and learn how businesses are scaled. And it just afforded me so much knowledge, but then PR grew into marketing. It grew into being on the founding team at Zillow 12.5 years ago, and then sort of grew from there within the company.
But from there, you were, then you became CMO, but then you became COO. So I find it really just interesting that your perspective just completely opened, and you really went from being a marketing executive to a really operating executive, effectively running the whole company. So was that a leap for you to make, or was that just sort of an organic, that was just your trajectory and your growth?
It felt organic. In being CMO, I had started out as sort of a one-person shop in the early days and grew the marketing function to a couple hundred people. So there was an operating role in that. But a big part of my role today as COO is the people side of the business, right? The thing that so many of us are trying to solve: how do we hire and retain the very best people we can, and how do we create a culture where people want to stick around for a long time, where it's not just a job, it's a career. And there's a lot of marketing elements to that, to your employer brand and how you talk to your employees. There's deeply understanding their needs, just like you would your customers as a marketer. It's being creative about how do we solve these needs. It's creating an employer brand that people can be proud of and that attract people in a very competitive hiring environment. And it's thinking long term: what can we create from the benefits perspective, from the comp perspective, from the perks perspective, to create a place where people love to come to work every day and want to tell all their friends about it.
And you, of course, have a very close relationship with Spencer as the CEO and someone you've worked alongside with for so many years. What is that relationship like? And does he rely on you to sort of to push back on him when need be?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. It's Spencer, but it's not just Spencer. We have a pretty extraordinary leadership team at Zillow Group where most of us have been with the company a decade or more. So we have a long history of time of working together and relying on each other and trusting relationships. But specific to Spencer and specific to the COO role, like in a lot of companies and a lot of tech companies, the COO role is kind of this amorphous role that is really a bunch of projects that are really important to the CEO and the company, but he or she don't have time to focus on in that moment, right? So what are things that are very important to Spencer, but he can't go as deep as he would like on them? Things like the people side of the business and diversity and inclusion, super important to him, but he doesn't have the time as a public company CEO to go super deep on the execution of these programs, and he wants to know that there's someone he trusts that can do it. And I see more and more companies looking at the COO role like that, a complement to the CEO of what are these areas of the business that are important. But there are so many demands on today's CEOs that they certainly can't cover it all.
It also often seems that in the tech world today, and you and I have spoken about this, that role seems to be held often by a woman. Is that true, or do you think there's something to that?
I think we see it more and more, and I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I mean, certainly you can talk to some of the personality traits that women can tend to bring to the table, but I think I like to view it as, the more women we have in COO roles, the more women we're going to have in CEO roles in the future. And I'm so pleased to see more and more women in these C-level positions with strong respect and seats at the table with their CEOs, and I'm excited to see what that leads to in 5 years when we're sitting up here talking about the trend of more women CEOs.
Who has a question for Amy? Does anyone have a question out there? I certainly have more. About one right here.
Hi, this is Lisa from Reverie. So can you speak to your leadership team's longevity and some of the success factors that have led you to be together for so long?
Sure. One of the things that we have that I think is pretty extraordinary is among each other a trust, and just not like politics. No one's working around each other. I think we all understand that as a team we can create something so much bigger than if we're really in it and working with it for ourselves. And I credit Spencer for creating this culture among us, that we all feel that way. But also there are things we do in just the frequency with how we meet with each other, in the things we share with each other, in the fact that a couple times a year we go off and have some quiet time together to think about strategy. But the biggest thing for me, when people ask me what it's like, I say there's just no politics, right? None of us is in it for ourselves. And having been through all the stages of the business, from private company to an IPO to a public company to today an $8 or $9 billion public company, it is that teamwork that makes it work. And I think about that a lot with my teams too, and how I coach them on working with each other, because sometimes it's just human nature to think about yourself, but when you're doing that, you're probably not going to be there for a long time then. You're going to choose to move on.
Anyone else? Oh, right here.
Hi, Melissa with Girl Up at the UN Foundation. I've found your story of being young and knowing exactly what you wanted to do. And I feel like I give that advice a lot to teenage girls, like, don't prescribe, like, be open to opportunity. What would you go back and tell your younger self now that you've kind of come on the other side of that broadcast career?
So I agree with you. It's the curiosity and being open to opportunity, but also, like, instead of visualizing where you want to be or what title you want to have or what you want to achieve in 5 or 10 years, I think the right question is, what do you want to learn? How do you want to expand your skills? If you're looking and saying, I have this skill set, these are the things I don't have, it's setting the goals of, how do I get experience in these things? Or how do I network with more people? Or how do I, can I try to get on a board? It's more that than trying to distinctly picture where or what you want to be. Because 9 times out of 10, when you do that, that's not what you get, right? But if you open yourself up, you can sometimes just be amazed by the other opportunities that come your way when it's not tied to a specific outcome.
Anyone else? You mentioned earlier in your career being able to watch how crises were handled, et cetera. Can you give us an example of a crisis at Zillow that you had to really jump in and get up to your elbows in?
Oh my gosh. I mean, we're in real estate. So, I mean, we launched Zillow in early 2006, which, if anyone remembers, like, the real estate was booming. And part of our early success, our product-driven success, was in February of 2006. We launched a product that told you what your home was worth, right? So it became so viral. It was like, oh my gosh, look how much money I'm making on paper. Well, what happened a year later? Right? We fell into the largest housing recession of our entire lifetimes. And all of a sudden, we're sitting there going, we have a product that tells you what your home is worth, and it's pissing people off, right? What do you do with that? And that was a time, actually, where a crisis of identity and product turned into a massive opportunity, because we sat and we said, we are on the precipice of something that's really bad. No one in the real estate industry right now is telling the truth. Like, infamously, in 2007, there were commercials on TV by the National Association of Realtors saying there's never been a better time to buy a home. It was the worst time to buy a home. And we said, we're sitting on this data with information on every single home in America. We have an opportunity to start telling people the truth. And it may not be what they want to hear, but it was at this time that we started building out our economics and data science team, and we started doing a lot of predictive science around what's going to happen with the housing market, what's actually happening. How do you make the decision, should I sell or buy right now? And it was kind of depressing news to hear, but it was the truth. And we built a brand then on that transparency and truthfulness where people could trust us.
Was that the Zestimate?
Zestimate, yeah.
The Zestimate. How many people have Zestimated their own house? Okay, everybody uses it. We're almost out of time, but I'll ask you one more question. Do you want to be a CEO?
I'd love to be a CEO someday, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll look for that. Amy, thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.